good vibrations.
So my guest today is Steve from the Sovereignty Group, and we're here to talk about a difficult subject, which is not for everyone, but it's one that I've been delving into myself for the past year and a half, and that's the whole idea of this soul trap and asking questions about the true nature of this realm, what created it, and what the hell, excuse the pun, we're doing here. So welcome, Steve.
Hello, Mark, and hello to all the good spirits out there.
Thank you. So it's all down to you, really, because you were the one that turned me on to this whole subject area. So what happened was, just to put a bit of context on it, I've obviously been doing conspiracy research for a number of years now, best part of 20 years. I've been down all the rabbit holes, learnt all about secret societies and who really runs the world and the way they get it done and symbolism and ritual and all this stuff. And you reach a point where I think all these roads converge to a single point, which is asking what this place is in the first place, and why all this stuff happens. You know, what sort of conditions could facilitate all these things to be able to occur in the first place? In other words, what's the true nature of this reality in which we find ourselves? And you reached out to me, what would it be, about 2 years ago, I think, two and a half
Yeah,
years?
yeah, 2.5 years ago, something like that. Yeah,
Yeah, and you sent me an email talking about this subject area, which you yourself had started looking at. And initially, I rejected it because at that point, I was so up to my neck in conspiracy stuff and lies and deception and realizing that everything that we're ever told is deceptive that I thought, no, this is too much. You know, it's too much to assume that even when these lives are done and we finally get out of this madhouse, lunatic asylum, even then there's even more deception and lies to face and combat. It's just too much for me. So I politely thanked you for the email and I kind of parked it in the back of my mind. And then I came back to it a few months down the line. I can't remember what it was that triggered it, but I remembered what you'd said to me. And I really started looking at this subject area anew. And partly it was triggered by events in my own life and things that my friends were going through. And I was realizing that so many ostensibly good people that are trying to do the right thing, they're trying to live in right action, they're trying to do no harm or minimize harm as much as they can to other living sentient beings, and they're taking care of their personal behaviors. They're keeping them in check and trying to make this world a better place, trying to combat evil, trying to shine the spotlight on all the wrongdoing that goes on here. And the only thing that they seem to reap in response to those efforts is a whole world of shit, problems, hardships, struggles. And I started to think, well, this idea of karma, whereby you reap what you sow and you attract towards yourself that which is in sync with the way your consciousness is and the way you conduct yours is not here for our benefit or our growth or our evolution. And in fact, we find ourselves trapped here. And that creates all kinds of questions about what is the true nature of the force or the entity or the power that created this place. And what are we doing here? How did we find ourselves here? Because I don't remember signing up for this. And so here we are. And in January 2024, I started my so-called God series of videos where I really started delving deeply into these big questions. And I've had a few guests on, but not many over the course of the past year and a half. It's mainly been monologues where I've been giving my thoughts on this. But as you were the guy that kind of sparked my interest in this whole subject area in the first place, I thought it would be a good idea to get you on and get some of your own perspectives. So maybe you could start by saying, by telling us what introduced you to these ideas and these concepts, what got you on board with it all, and what were your initial feelings when you came across these ideas, these suggestions? How did it make you feel about yourself and about life? So maybe we should start there.
yeah, certainly. Well, yeah, great introduction, and very humble of you to even suggest that I'd, planted that those thoughts in you. But really, I think whenever we're getting all these thoughts, they come from a culmination of different areas, don't they? They all seem to come up at one time. And had it not been for me, it most definitely would have been someone else, because the truth, the soul trap now is really coming to light. But before I go into detail about that, I think it's important that on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you so much for the sterling work that you've done over the years, and very brave work as well, exposing evil and your tenacity and just helping the truth get out there. So, I think I'll forget towards the end of the interview, but I'd rather say that now. So, without talking about me too much, there are a little bit sort of lightweight disclaimers I'd like to say. But first things first is that there's no benefits for me really to do this sort of interview. It's not, there's nothing I'm gaining for it. It's just that I'd like to sort of chip in, and because I can see so many people going down the wrong routes, and well, right or wrong, but I feel as if people are getting distracted, and so it's easy just to try to help simplify things. And I'm pretty much a student in this myself. I've got more questions than I have answers, and no one really has the full answers to all of this. So what I'll do is I'll try to go through some of the areas of my background and how I initially came to this and how I got to the soul trap. And really, it starts off from when I was a child, looking at the world and looking, as you say, at the insanity of this. And for me, it was like nature, the natural order. And as a child looking at the programs, I realized that, hold on a minute, is this really how life is? When animals will eat animals alive? And then I started looking at sort of generations of how people were always in survival mode. When my great grandparents were struggling financially, and then my grandparents, my parents, and then I catch myself even now, sort of worrying, always in this sort of survival. And that, hold on a minute, and there was so many red flags, and there's a term what I call inverted karma, where no good deed goes unpunished. And when I've seen so many amazing people running animal sanctuaries, for example, and they suffer, immeasurable suffer, sort of aggressive cancers or whatever.
Exactly.
And
I think we need to make inverted karma a new term, because it says a lot.
And then for whatever reasons, I stumbled at the age of 14 onto anti-vivisection movement, and I got immersed in that. And that was my first sort of quote unquote sort of truth movement sort of introduction, where there was a trilogy where I noticed the corrupt police, were in cahoots with the corrupt courts, in cahoots with the corrupt media, and those three together. Now, at the age of 14, working that out or being exposed to that, I knew that people live up until the 90s and they still didn't see that. No, this is no boast. I'm just saying I just happened to be in that position at that time. So that was early stages for me. So then I naively thought, all I need to do is go back in September, tell the teachers and tell my schoolmates, and hey presto. For those of us who know what it's like sharing the truth, we've got cognitive dissonance, we've got all that whole package. So the early days for me, this sort of activism and quote unquote truth seeking, I realized that what it really is, it's just facing reality. That's what truth seeking is about. And it's about levels, degrees of awareness. What you've done, for example, Mark, throughout your career is pattern recognition. That's all you've done. It's the scientific method. Hold on a minute. That's happening there, that's happening there to the music industry or whatever subject any of us are studying, and it's all about pattern recognition. And I looking at the truth and realities in mainly three elements. So the first one is having that desire, that passion. Because most people don't even have that, that sort of spark. And it doesn't matter how uncomfortable where it takes you, you should be able to go there. And the second one is putting in the hours, so having that dedication, and if you can try and be a bit humble to know that we're constantly learning, we're constantly a student. And the third one, which trips all of us up, is discernment between the misinformation and then the disinformation. So, are you okay for me to go into detail about the subject of awareness?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'll just jump in here by saying it's not hard to see why people reject this idea and they try all kind of avoidance tactics to not look at it because it's a bleak one and it changes your entire worldview and your spiritual paradigm and not necessarily for the better. So we must find ways of leaving this conversation on a positive note. That's my disclaimer. I want to, before we wrap up the conversation, I want to put a positive slant on it and just find reasons for optimism wherever they are. I think that's very important when we deal with this subject matter because we don't want people going out and gassing themselves in their garage, do we?
No, well, I mean, ultimately, to face reality is ultimately going to be a positive trait, or no matter what. It's like, I don't know, going to the dentist or looking at something. How bad is your car? Ultimately, as difficult as it is, you've got to face that, and it's just like I say, just facing reality. So yeah, overall, it is actually positive in the long run.
Yeah, well, that's good.
Um,
And
yeah,
also, you're either someone that wants the truth no matter what, as you
yeah,
just alluded to there, no matter how unsettling it might be or how inconvenient, or you're happy to live under lies and deception and you don't mind things being sugar coated and served up to you. I think people fall into one of those two categories. And if you're in the first, then you have to go wherever the truth takes you. And ultimately, it's going to lead to these kind of questions. And I'm always someone that if there's bad news to be had, I'm just like, hit me with it. Let's have it. Give it me now because I need to know. I need to get it out of my system and process it. And I think most people listening to this podcast would fall into that first category. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here.
yeah, sure. Although there's the multiple degrees, and then I mean, like you mentioned at the beginning, you put things on the shelf temporarily, but ultimately, if you're driven enough, you will go there. So I've got these wee little charts. I don't know if you're okay to put those up there, but one of them is like a circular, it's like an onion rings. It's the awareness chart.
Yeah, I'll find a way of getting those graphics into the show.
Okay, all right. So on the topic of awareness, I mean, a whole book could be written about this. It's such a huge subject. If we think about, for example, self-defense, what they're constantly talking about all the time is situational awareness. So someone who's got less skill set, less techniques, but they've got a high level of situational awareness, they're going to be in a lot safer situation. Likewise with, say, outdoor survivalists, they're constantly this theme about being aware of your environment, being aware. So this is a huge subject, but it does come in divisions, and this is to represent our wake up call. So on an outer ring on this diagram, I'm calling this observational area. This is the stage where people are screaming at the TV, complaining about the corruption, the local councils, but their solution, unfortunately, is politics and voting. And this is kind of like a stage of whether someone is going to stay in that and how much they're paying attention with. And the stage after that is what we would call sort of the agenda, the quote unquote conspiracies, New World Order, whatever, where people realize that, okay, so there is chaos, but there is a reason behind the chaos and there is an agenda. But the problem I find with this, and I was trapped in this for a long, long time, 25 years or whatever, is that it's a bit like George Carlin said, if you think you can think you can fix this world, you're part of the problem. I'm not saying don't do anything or apathy, but I'm saying it's this fixation on activism that this world can be fixed by certain activities that we can do, and I don't think this world can actually be fixed. I think we can do micro help, like this interviews and the work that you do, but as far as fixing this world, I don't think we can do that.
Yeah, I see it as stemming the tide. That's what I call it. And when I think back to 2020, I was so zealous and evangelical myself with the COVID situation. And I was making videos and I was doing speeches at rallies and going to all these events and stuff. And I thought at the time that if enough of us get engaged in this sort of activity, we can turn this situation around, force the masses to confront what's going on, all the lies, all the deception, and we really stand a chance of bringing this control system down. Here we are 5 years later, and of course, we haven't. And if anything, we could say that things have got worse in terms of what they're trying to roll out. So clearly, we can't change things. And like you say, that's not to say that we should sit back and do nothing. I certainly don't advocate that. And I do feel that those of us that got out there on the playing field during the COVID years did stem the tide somewhat. And things probably would be a bit worse on many fronts if we had done nothing. So we absolutely should stay engaged and combat evil and wrongdoing where we find it. But ultimately, I've come to the realization that we can't fix this place because it's unfixable. I think that's what you're getting at there.
Yes, it's part of the design. You know, we're trying to make a cat a dog. You know, we're trying to make, you know, a bicycle an airplane. But the design of this is, which I'll go into a little bit in a bit, but it isn't designed to, you know, to be fixed. And the trouble also in this stage, is this agenda stage, is that I catch people. I've been like this myself. Would say, "Look what they're doing to us now." You know, look what's next. Look what's next, and you're constantly on this loop and going down rabbit holes where it's almost a trap in itself. And I think eventually, on this diagram, if I can jump one of the rings and go to the fourth area, which is the spiritual, generally speaking, as I describe it, you can go so far and you get spat out the other side, and until you realise that this is a spiritual gig. Although people it's mentioned all the time in the conspiracy world, but ultimately, when you really sit down with someone, so say someone who's been involved in conspiracies for 20 years, you'll start to see their eyes roll. It's the same sort of thing, like talking to as they would be talking to the family about conspiracies. You know what I mean? It's sort of, they kind of get it, but you really got to feel it in your heart that this is a spiritual realm. And then this opens up a whole package of the nature of reality, questioning whether this is an AI type simulation, and looking into the sort of metaphysics and yeah, and this is really ultimately, I think, perhaps the journey that you've made yourself in the last, say, 3 or 4 years, you know.
Yeah, it's essential to get out of that mindset where you're just looking at the aspects of the conspiracy, the fine detail, the nuts and bolts. You know, like you say, what agenda are they rolling out now? Oh my God, look what they're doing to us next. I see so many podcasts, so many YouTubers, so many videos that just focus daily. They do daily updates on, oh, they're doing this now and they want to roll that plan out. And your eyes do start to glaze over eventually because it's just detail. It's just more and more detail. And it gets us nowhere. And you have to cross that line and go beyond all that and say, okay, I get that they're trying to control us and surveil us and lock us down and all this stuff. Why? You know, for what reason? What is this place? What is this realm? What are the circumstances in which these kind of situations can actually occur, are allowed to occur? And then you start shifting your paradigm and you start asking much bigger questions which matter more. You know, the surface detail will always be there, the background chatter, it's not going anywhere. So you may as well transcend all that and start trying to figure out why all this stuff is happening, right?
Definitely, yeah. I describe it as the mold on the wall, Mark. You know, some people looking at the brown mold, some looking at the black mold, some people looking at the mushrooms, and a surveyor will walk in, an experienced surveyor, and go, "Oh no, it's the roofing felt, it's getting in the cavity, and therefore," you know what I mean? I'm just, you know, so it's the actual, really sort of a deeper level, and I think the three way I look at it is the three barriers that they've put in place, wherever they are, um, to stop us getting to this spiritual position. Um, First of all, is religion, all religion, even though we can glean some interest from them. And the second one is atheism. So these two are bouncing. This is the dialectic. They always keep us Pepsi versus Coke, red team versus blue team. But for those of us can see through this dialectic, they offer a third option, just like politics, but they offer us in spiritual terms a new age movement, which is super powerful. And I think like all of these, they offer some goodness in these, and otherwise we'd see through them. It's a bit like Alex Jones. Alex Jones has to speak some truth, but New Age to me is junk spirituality. And I think Tony Sayers is doing a cracking job on exposing the New Age movement. But I think we need punk spirituality. We need an attitude with this. We need to be mature. We need to be sort of sharp and less naive when we're talking about spiritual subjects.
Yeah, sure. It's very appealing the way they've packaged these new age ways of thinking, because I fell for it myself for many years. And I think it's there as the de facto spiritual belief system for truthers. So, like you say, very early on in your truth journey, you're going to realize that the orthodox organized religions are mind control, and you're going to reject them. So, unless you go down the atheist path, then you're going to have to try and find something else to fill that spiritual vacuum. And they've packaged together this way of looking at things, which is very appealing to truthers. It teaches that Earth is a schoolhouse and we make the decision on a soul level before we come here to incarnate and to go through these experiences, and therefore our own growth, our own evolution. And we go through successive lifetimes to try and learn these lessons and reach a point of enlightenment. And when we get there, we might stand a chance of getting out of here. All of that is complete nonsense, of course, when you break it down, because when you factor in the mind wipe, it makes a nonsense of this idea of cumulative lesson learning, because you don't remember anything you went through the previous time. And clearly, these lives are not for our benefit. They're just not. We have inverted karma, like we said, that the better you try and be as a person, the more you try and help others, the better you try and make this world, the more suffering and hardship you're going to reap as a result. And that's the scientific method. It's observable, it's testable, it's repeatable. Anyone can try it. Try it in your own life and see what happens to you. The results speak for themselves. So these new age ways of seeing things have clearly been planted there, in my view, as a way of steering well-meaning people off down the garden path and keeping away from the devastating truth of what this place really is.
So almost coming to the soul trap now, but just on this sort of chart area, on this sort of third ring, I'm going backtracking now. This area is what I find people do is they jump from, as I did, jump from the gender to the spiritual side. But unfortunately, it's a bit of a gear crunch. And there is another area which I think lots of people miss out on. And I'm going to label this as a history. So in between sort of the conspiracies and spiritual, there's looking at history. Now, I don't just mean looking at Tartaria and things like that, but the important subject of looking at World War One, World War Two, and who we've been told to be evil. Now, because this might go out on YouTube, I'm going to sort of curb how I describe this, but it is vitally important, because one of the things we've got to do if we are going to be discerning, because ultimately we're talking about the soul trap and when we die. I'll talk about that in a minute, but one of the things that we must not be is naive, and we must accept that all history is a lie agreed upon, so to speak. And just as a hint, what I'm talking about, I can't go into detail because we are curved, unfortunately, but there's a couple of books I would highly recommend. One is called The Myth of German Villainy by Benton L. Bradbury. And the other one is Hellstorm, which is also a film, and it's The Death of Nazi Germany by Thomas Goodridge. And the reason I mention these is because without knowing this area and who's behind it, it's so easy for us to get hoodwinked. And this kind of slightly links in also in the subject of naivety. It's about talking about the touchy subject of race. So you think, well, if we're talking about spiritual subject, we're all the same. They want to say, well, we're all the same underneath. It's just skin color and everything. Though this is not about bringing down any races, just saying that we are different. If we, for example, biologists would talk about the different plants, the zoologists would talk about the different animals, arborists would talk about different trees, and we accept all that. We accept different dogs and everything. But when it comes to humans, oh no, we're all different, we're all exactly the same. But this is not true. It's clearly not true. And why I touch on this in terms of spirituality is because we must also be open that there is a possibility that we are different spirits as well. Many of the mystics have spoken about this, and over the years that we talk about sovereign spirits, and even contemporary now we're talking about NPCs, whether people are AIs or automatons and things like that. And so we need to be looking at these touchy subjects towards a direction of spirituality.
Sure. Yep.
So finally, the soul trap. So what is unfortunately it is called a soul trap, but another way of describing that is a soul trick or deception. For those,
Well, exactly. I was going to ask you because Tony Sayers uses the phrase soul trick, which he prefers to soul trap. So yeah, trap is a bit harsh. So yeah, elaborate on that, please.
Yeah, well, the trap seems sort of removable, but if we look about a deception, there's a way, the possibility that we may be able to get around it. So, as above, so below. So we're talking about duplicity. We have been duped. So the soul trap basically is that we are caught in this loop. We have been duped through the reincarnation process to keep coming back for incarnations. Why? There are multiple reasons, and I'll talk about that in a second. But for me, my journey has been not only the activism and the truth, but also parallel to that has been trying to work out what the hell's going on and why we're here, and the spiritual sides. And I've been to hundreds of meetings, and God knows how many books I've bought, and trying to work things out. Nothing, Mark, has associated my interest in this until ... came across the soul trap. And for me, all the dominoes fell in place. It was like, I describe it as the king of all truths. And I've looked at all the counter arguments, and I just think they're pathetic. So this is why I ran with it, and this is why I set up the group, which is pretty it died really, but I still leave the website up there. It's sovereigntygroup.co.uk. It's just for information of those people who are coming new to this, but that's why I really went for this one, and it makes so much more sense to me. And so that's why we're having this conversation now. If you wish, I can go through some of the components for those who are new to this, and we can correspond with this chart that I was going to show you.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So to keep it simple, I was going to divide it into 3 areas. So this is just the mechanics of what the components of what the soul trick is. So the first component I've described as viscerally overwhelmed. So this is when we die, and this is the process of what happens apparently when we die. So the first stage I've split into 2, and that's part of the trick, being viscerally overwhelmed, is what they call the light. So this can be the tunnel of light, or sometimes the stairway of light, stairway to heaven, so to speak. So they tell us in the messages, so this is a bit like kind of going to a rave when you're so overwhelmed with all the drugs and the lighting. It's a real visceral sort of emotive sort of. They get you into this. It's a prepping stage, really. And alongside this is the love bombing. So it's like a frequency or a zapping. And mothers have described this love bombing as 20 times more powerful than love of their own child. So with the light and the love bombing. This is the first stage. So it's sort of almost like drugging you into what they're about to the next stage, which I call processing.
Yeah, sorry, Steve. So you're getting this information from the experiences of near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, right? And what they come back and tell us
Yes,
they've seen.
yes, that's generally speaking, out of body experience, near death experiences, and speaking to people, and generally, I think like get all sorts of information. You know, it's a combination of different areas, but generally, yeah, near death experiences. Which most near death experiences, although the people are authentic, they have been duped. And they're telling you their authentic story, but it's looking beyond that. And some of the some of the links on my website will go into much detail about this.
Well, I've seen many of Tony Sayers' videos on this subject where he takes apart the testimonies of near-death experiences. Most of them come back and say, "Oh, it was wonderful. It was a fantastic place, but these spirit guides told me that I had a mission to complete on Earth, so I had to come back into my body." And very few of them, if any, seem to question why that is and why they couldn't just stay where they wanted to stay, why they were getting forced to come back or coerced to come back. And I guess most of these near-death experiences would have been what we might term normies or NPCs, in their lives. So they weren't of a questioning kind of mindset. I think if a truth seeker, a critical thinker, were to pass over, they would probably see things quite differently. And if they were getting coerced or found themselves getting forced to come back by some sort of spirit guides or elders or whatever, they would be more of a mindset to say, well, no, actually, I'm not going back. I'm sovereign, I'm free, and I choose to either stay where I am or transcend to a different level. So most of these NDE accounts that we get seem to be from people of a mainstream mindset. Would you agree with it?
Yes, I would. Yes, but I'm not ruling out that because of this first stage, this overwhelming, if severely overwhelmed stage, that some of us could be duped. So if we're talking about ultimately, I will try to talk about some sort of solution, but getting back to the survival, this sort of awareness, it's all about the pounding this thing about preparation. So, to stay, the time we have now is so important that we prep for this, so we get into this sort of mindset, and we study the subject, which I'll talk about. Yeah, so the sort of second stage really is what I call the processing stage, and that again is split into two. So this the first stage of this is life review. So this is where they go over, it's like an interview, and they go through your whole life. So everything is monitored every single second, all the embarrassing state levels, every single moment of our life has been reviewed, monitored. And this, again, getting back to the normies, and the difference with someone who's a bit feisty and a bit sort of aware of what's going on is this thing about perceived authority. So when people are going through this life review, they will have elders, and usually it's about their life's belief systems. So it could be religion, it could be any sort of belief system, their worldview. That's taken into this sort of interview stage. Now it's like a job where there's a nepotism and someone's cousin is definitely getting a job, but the company has to go through the process anyway of interviewing, say, 5 people. You're going for this interview knowing they know that you're going to fail. And the reason they're going to fail is because the second stage of this processing is the life script, because ultimately they want to get you into this life script where they give you your life set ahead of you. So you're going to fail there, or ultimately, it could be something like empathy, or you've got to go back to the next life to empathy. You've got to go back to patience, but always find something. You hurt your sister when you're 5 years old, something pathetic about. And so the life script, then we have to ask this big question: how much free will do we really have? Is it limited? And okay, we can choose a coffee, we can choose a tea, but really, how much of our life is scripted? But that's the second stage. I don't know if you want to interject at that point.
Well, yeah, it just feels as if the odds are stacked against us from the start when we come in here. You know, it's not a level playing field. The table is tilted, and we don't really stand a chance. If the only way to get out of here is to live a perfect life where you don't affect anybody else or anything else in any negative way, uh, nobody's going to be able to achieve that because it's impossible because of the conditions that we find ourselves up against here.
Yeah.
So the game is rigged from the start, and if that's the basis on which we're being judged, it was never fair, and we never really stand a chance. So the good news has to lie elsewhere, I guess.
Yeah, sure. There is a bit of misconception about this life script that and the life review is that we definitely enter into a contract. I personally don't go along with that. It might be possible that some people enter a contract. The idea is that we have that option, that choice. But I think in some cases people are literally shoved back into life. So it's not always necessarily a contractual agreement. So there's a bit of a debate going on in the soul trap community, so to speak. So the third stage of this, the components to the soul trick, is what I call positioning. And again, this is split into two. So the first stage of this is where we will have soul groups. So when we've we've gone through the process, we're going through into our next life. So it's going to be set up that we have people, fundamental people in our lives. So it could be family members, it could be long-term employers, but people, sort of stable people in our lives, good and bad. And people could be going through traumas, so childhood traumas, whatever. But these people are part of the soul group, but we don't have any choice on it. That seems to be sort of a pattern that comes up quite a lot. And the second stage of this positioning is the amnesia, which you mentioned, otherwise known as the memory wipe. Sometimes it's referred to as the veil of forgetfulness. Now, this is kind of like the club card of the argument for the soul trick, because this will, if you're going to a college and you failed a certain section, when you went back to college and you failed on 15%, they said, well, don't worry, you've only got to cover this area, and this is what you failed on last time. But when we're in this life, we have pretty much a complete memory wipe, and therefore we have to start off right from scratch and go through the whole process again. And so that's pretty much a strong argument for the soul trick.
Well, that dynamic is not there for our benefit, clearly, is it?
Exactly. There's a couple of little elements that I'd like to add to this. Is something which I call scarring, which I think the proper term is transferred phobias, where people may have a real phobia about water, and that's from a previous life. They might have had that. I think that's quite an obvious one, but that's more of a bullet point, really. And there's something else which in the prison community they called recidivism. Is that correct? Where they have institutionalized repeaters, offenders. So the kind of people who have gone through the system again and again and again, and they've been systemized and they have familiarity with the system. So whereas the new agers will say old soul, new souls, old souls are more enlightened people. I'm just going to be awkward, and I'm going to throw out that it could actually be inverse of that. We're living in an inverted reality, so everything they say is the opposite. So if the new agers are saying old souls are the more enlightened, I'm going to suggest it might be the opposite. It might be that people have had so many lifetimes that they have become institutionalized, and we talk about NPCs or whatever, but they're so conditioned by this system that this is so familiar. But it could be the case that young souls are the ones that are going, hold on a minute, this is bollocks. Why are we going through this? This is mad to us. As children, we know that this is insane, this system.
Yeah, that sounds plausible.
Yeah. And so sharing the truth. So those of us who've been around, trying to share the truth and try for a while, I would suggest trying to get this message across to people. I look at it like setting up a fire. So tinder, kindling, and fuel and logs. So the first stage of tinder is checking out if that person's got a spark in them, as far as have they got any degree of awareness of spirituality. If they're not really involved, they're not open to ideas on spirituality, I don't even go there. These days, I don't. It's not worth it. And if they are open to that and they talk about, the questioning about the nature of reality, then the second stage, I call it kindling stage, is to talk about reincarnation. That's a biggie. And I would suggest to people that they invest in amazing books by Ian Stevenson. So for those of you who haven't heard of him, he was a child psychologist who was a skeptic of reincarnation, who devoted 40 years of his life, him and his wife and a small team, for 20,000 case studies, where they went through mainly sort of children up to the age of 7, children's case studies of reincarnation. Now, he would hear children will come into his surgery and they would say, "My other mummy, my other lifestyle," in great detail, where they distances of 600 miles, different culture, different language. Children that hadn't even left the village, hadn't been on a train, would know all the intimate details of the infrastructure, the drainage of little secret sexual interests of their partner. They'd know the nickname of the dogs. They'd know where the will was hidden under the floorboards, where grandma kept her stamps, things like this. So one of Dr. Stevenson's traits was that he would have photographs of birthmarks of children, where, for example, the person would have been hung, and then the child would be born with birthmarks, red marks around their neck, or if they cut their wrists, around their wrists, and snake bites and things. And he's got all these photographs. And then finally, then I would talk about the soul trap, but you really do have to go through those two areas first.
Yeah, sure. So the whole soul trap idea and just the concept of questioning the nature of what we might call God and what this place is, who created it, it's a real zeitgeist for these times. It's a subject area that's become very popular. And it reminds me of the way flat Earth became a thing a few years ago. And inevitably, that will lead some to suggest that it means it's some kind of psyop. So a lot of people will say if many people, particularly in the so-called truther community, are going down a particular route and talking about a particular idea, it must have been seeded somehow by the other side to lead everyone off down the garden path. I personally don't feel that's the case with this. I think it's an idea whose time has come, and it's kind of garnered this energy exponentially on its own because it's got the ring of truth about it. So many people are resonating with it because it's awakening a curiosity within them. That's what happened with me. But some will suggest that it's some sort of psyop. So, what are your feelings on that?
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm obviously the latter. I'm biased on that one. I mean, the conversation often crops up with proof. Give me proof. We hear this all the time, no matter what the subject is. Well, I think there's proof versus substantial evidence. And all we can do, getting back to that term pattern recognition, we can just look at all this sort of substantial evidence and just dive into reincarnation alone as a first stage and really sort of and you mentioned the word resonate. So to me, all I can say is I can't prove anything to anyone. I can just present this information and horses for courses. Really, it's just it's up to each individual. And I suppose, yeah, one of the interesting things on that sort of ring chart, when I was going back to the first stage when people their first stage of waking up, when this sort of observational stage, at that level, people are. I think there's three currencies in this world, as I see them. At their first stage, they're looking at this the way the world is set up, and all the woes of what's going on, and they're looking at it as money. They think that and that's understandable why they would think that, corrupt councils, corrupt governments, whatever, and all the corporations, money, money, money. But this is not paying attention. And then at the agenda stage, when people work out there's actually reasoning behind the chaos, they would say, "Oh, no, it's not money. Money is just the grease to keep this machine going, but it's actually power and control." But for those of us who are sort of going in deeper now, and we're sort of looking at the spiritual level, we would realize that it's actually an umbrella term I've used, harvesting. And there's one subject I'm sure that crops up from time to time is the subject of luch and why we're here. This to me is sure evidence. And for those of you who don't know what luch means, it's a term that Robert Monroe coined, and ultimately it's emotional energy harvest. But on my little diagram here, I've got a window, four areas. I would say there's more to it than just luch, and I look at there's four areas of the meaning of life and what these people want from us. If we think about the film The Matrix and us as the battery, the overall harvesting is, first one is luch, and that is positive and negative. And because we talk about the negative sides of luch, like the fear and anxiety and things like that, but there's also a superficial positive. So I call these excitants. So let's say, for example, the hype coming up to Christmas, all the excitement, hypersexuality, the alcohol, the drugs, the hedonism, things like that. So this
Raves, I guess, and football games exactly. And things of this nature.
Exactly, yeah. So this is kind of loose. And then the second element of what I think they get from us is a sadistic entertainment. An example of that would be, let's say, for example, if we're talking about what's gone on in Palestine, and people say, well, what's gone on? But it's not so much what, it's how. How has this happened? In our lifetime, all been televised, and everyone can see what's going on. It's all across the media. It's sometimes not what's happened to it, it's the actual sadistic nature of how people die, and that's another element which I think they gain. And then a third element is, I think they degrade and deplete our spirit essence. So this is our life force energies, different to luch. This is about, you see someone when they're adolescent, they have their dreams, their hopes, and you see that person so many years later, and it's like they've had their life force energy kicked out of them. This sort of spirit that they're depleting and degrading the spirit essence. And then finally, the fourth area, which I think they're harvesting from us, is our creative energy. So we ask, where is all the good force? Where are the good angels? Where are the good gods? Well, I think it's us, the sovereign spirits, specifically. We are the good people, the goodness we bring into this world. And in terms of harvesting our creative energy, people also talk about downloading our dreams. I don't know much about this, but this is something I've heard quite a few times, that the sucking and draining we bring in the creative energy to this world. And all these four elements, I think that's the meaning of life. And to me, this is evidential. This is what I'm observing all the time, and I've observed since a child. To me,
the level of evil that we're talking about here that would be capable of things like this just beggars belief. Wanting to destroy people's hopes and dreams, and systematically setting out to just make people just crush them and destroy them, you know. I mean, if this were the plot to a movie and there was some evil force that wanted to do that to humanity, most people would probably walk out of the movie theater saying, oh, that plot was so far-fetched, that was just ridiculous. And yet that seems to be what's happening on a cosmic level. So the degree of evil that's capable of this, I don't think regular humans are capable of. So it's coming from somewhere else.
Exactly. I've always said that. I mean, the counter argument to when we were talking about truth for years, many of us have been speaking about truth herself. They'd say, you couldn't organize that. They can't even the families themselves, they argue. And I get that argument. It comes across as a strong argument, but it's not until you realize, hold on a minute, there are spiritual forces behind all this. And that's why things, go as clockwork, so to speak. But on a positive note.
Hey, we got there in the end.
Yeah, I know. But you've got to get this sort of you've got to look at the damage first before you do the repairs. Okay, so we hinted that we can't necessarily fix this world in the way that we'd like to. However, if we're looking at this as a soul trick, then we've got to start looking at ways of getting out of this. And the ultimate way of ridding ourselves from this suffering is looking at the way of solutions to not being reincarnated. That's ultimately it. Now, I did say at the beginning I wouldn't be able to go into great detail because we'd need another 2 hours for this. But it seems that there are ways out of it. And you hinted that it is the type of person you mentioned about quote unquote normies that may not be, because they don't know. It's about awareness. They don't understand these subjects. They don't want to look at them. So unfortunately, they are going to have to go through the mill. But for those of us who've got some degree of awareness, there seems to be solutions. I look at this similar to sort of like self-defense and sort of like knowing like you've got this fight coming up. So it's imminent that we're all going to have this special day in our lives where we're going to quote unquote die. But if we've got awareness, it's all about prepping beforehand. A self-defense sort of example was where a woman was going through the process of being raped. And in the process, she kind of accepted it. And at one point, the rapist ripped her dress. And she was so outraged, she was livid that she just ripped her dress. And she got up and she turned on this and she got out of the situation where she was being. So a lot of the time in self-defense, it's really upstairs. It really is a mindset. If you're determined enough, and you take this seriously and you devote your time and energy, then I cannot see how you. Well, I can see plenty of solutions to how we're going to get out of it. So I really do think it's a mindset, and I would urge people to study this subject, take it very seriously, and allocate time for this. And perhaps in another conversation, Mark, we can look into some deeper solutions.
Well, we probably should, by the sounds of it, because my comprehension is that we are sovereign spirits. I feel that we are individuated emanations of the original God, if you like, or creative force. So gods in our own right, if you want to term it that way. And if we decide in our sovereign consciousness that we ain't coming back and no kind of perceived authority figure is going to make us or coerce us or persuade us, then it ought to be enough for us just to say, no, no, no. I stand in my power and I don't accept this. I don't consent. I'm not going back. No, you're not going to make me. And when it comes to processes of achieving enlightenment and, ways of transcending this trap, you hear all sorts of concepts about really hard, tough work that you have to do, inner work and meditation. And some people say you have to study for 30, 40 years. You have to pore over these texts daily, assume these poses and do these meditation techniques daily. Some people will say you need to take yourself up into some remote monastery in Nepal or something and just fast and stuff like that. And all of this sounds really difficult, and there's no guarantee that any of it's going to work. Perhaps the solution is much more simple than all of that. And it's simply standing in your power and being prepared to say no and accepting that you are the ultimate authority on where your consciousness goes. And if you decide you ain't coming back to this place, then that ought to be enough. You just keep saying no, stand in your power, never mind 30 years of meditation and looking at obscure texts. That ought to be enough. That's my way of seeing things.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. I have these three questions that just keep ruminating all the time. First one is, who am I? You know, recognizing, observing, and all these false identities around our personas. The second one is, where am I? Are we on this luch farm? Is it a prison planet? Is this a simulation? Looking at this non-materialistic realm, and is it a hell realm? And the third one is, how do I permanently get out of it?
Exactly. I mean, what questions could be any more important than that for anyone ever?
And on that bombshell, thank you very much for the conversation, Mark. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no worries. It's been great. And it sounds like there would be a lot of value in doing a follow-up then if you've got some further insights to share. So we've, laid the foundations with this one, and we should probably come back and do a part 2 at some point.
I reckon. Good. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. So hopefully we can go through some of those and then look deeper into solutions.
Sure. So whether people are looking at this on YouTube, Odyssey, or Rumble, feel free to drop comments, observations, questions in the chat thread below, and I'll be sure to comb through those, and maybe we can use some of those as the basis for a follow-up chat. So definitely get in touch with the feedback. And if people want to go to your website for further information or resource, that's available as a platform for that, right? The Sovereignty Group?
Yeah, absolutely. I may not be so responsive with emails. I've done that for years, and especially these subjects, you can talk about the inside of a ping pong ball for years. And I'll be respectful, but I hopefully people understand. I won't be able to go back and forth with I've got limited amount of time, but please, if there's overwhelming things you want to express or share, then please contact me by the website.
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing your perspectives today as we try and figure out all these questions between us.
Marvelous. Thank you, Mark.
All right. Cheers, mate.
Take care. Cheers. Bye. This is just a
I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up good vibrations. I'm picking up